I think the more you just learn about all of the different ways that people do things, the more you kind of refine and find what really resonates for you. And that's, I think, where the real gold is in anything in life, but especially in the horse world.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Reinforce the Horse. Today we are here with Ruby Doss, and Ruby is a holistic equine nutrition and wellness consultant with an emphasis on holistic nutrition as well as a trainer. She helps people become the best possible stewards for their horse's physical, mental, and emotional health. Hi Ruby, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing today?
Hi. Yeah, it's great to be here. Doing really well. How are you?
Doing really well. Thank you for asking. Would you like to share a little bit more about yourself and your journey?
Yeah. So I got into sort of a more holistic approach to horse care several years ago. I was showing pretty competitively, which I no longer do. And my horse at the time had started to develop arthritis. I was showing in dressage, and I think he was like 21 or 22 at this point, so not shocking that he had some arthritis. And the medication that was prescribed at the time was not legal at shows. So I did a little bit of research and started to kind of look into what I could use for him to help maintain his health, as well as hopefully manage his pain level, that I could continue to use at shows and we wouldn't have to interrupt his management routine. And I found all kinds of various herbs and stretching and body work and all kinds of things that at the time I had never really been exposed to. I didn't really ever give much thought to those. And I had a lot of success with that. And we were able to show for a few more years pretty successfully after finding those things. And then, so that was kind of when I opened my eyes to it. But then several years later, after that experience, I ended up getting a project horse. And he was like, still kind of makes me laugh to think about this, 17-2 thoroughbred that was bred for steeplechase. And for some reason that I will never understand, his full brother went to the Japanese Olympic steeplechase team. So he was like well-bred and like really on a track to be a jumper. And he ended up being bought as a 2-year-old by a rein cow horse trainer, which I just like laugh to think about, the 17-2 thoroughbred trying to like get low and move cows. But apparently they used him for cattle drives and they took him all over the country, and he actually was pretty good at it, supposedly. But when I found him and purchased him, he was like very underweight and just seemed kind of depressed and like not really loving his life. So my plan was to bring him back to health and sell him and help him find a home that had a job that was more appropriate for his size and temperament and all those things. And I, again, kind of went down this whole rabbit hole of equine nutrition because he was so underweight, and found that the nutrition was actually also really helpful for not just his weight, but also his temperament and his behavior. And he was super sensitive to it, so I could really tell right away when things were working or not working. And then that was what kind of prompted me to go actually study equine nutrition and get certified as a nutritionist. And just recently, I sort of realized that nutrition is just really one piece of a much bigger picture, and that body work and training and lifestyle, equine enrichment are all also equally important in maintaining a horse's health and managing their stress physically and emotionally, as diet and nutrition are. So I've kind of jumped into this more broad, holistic approach to horse health.
That's really great. Sounds like a really incredible background. So, shoot, it's been probably over a decade ago. I used to host another podcast called Get Fit Friday, and it had nothing to do with horses because horses hadn't entered my life then. But we talked a lot about fitness, and then as a result of fitness, of course, nutrition. I'm curious if your sort of segue into learning more about equine nutrition had anything to do with your own personal nutrition, and then also give a shout out to your newborn or relatively newborn daughter. So for our listeners, if you do hear her chatting in the background, she's got a 6-week-old. What's her name?
Poppy.
6-week-old daughter who, so she's definitely got her hands full right now. So thank you for having her join us as well. But on that idea of nutrition, it's, you mentioned, it being like one piece of a bigger puzzle. Tell us more about your take on that, not only as it relates to the horse, but as us as humans as well.
Yeah, so I definitely I was really lucky, actually. My dad and I are also really close. Seems like you two are really close. And he is an athlete and also a firefighter. And he always emphasized to me, you're in a physical sport, you need to take care of your body. And from a very young age, he was like, if you're going to be showing and competitive, and which was all driven by me, he never pushed for any of that. But he supported me and was just, if you're going to be using your body this extensively, you need to be thinking about cross training and feeding yourself well and really making sure that you're fueling your body as well as, it's very taxing, the amount of riding that I was doing at the time. And so that was, from an early age, a really strong influence for me. But then I think it was around in high school at some point, I started having some like hypoglycemia episodes and fainting at school. And I was like having a hard time balancing my blood sugar. And our family doctor at the time had given me some advice, and I was trying to work with it, and it wasn't really working. And then I ended up when I went to college, I went to a different doctor, and he told me some kind of extreme advice. He said, for like, I think it was 90 days, I want you to eat nothing but whole foods. And that's like, and being a college freshman, that was a little bit challenging because I was living in a dorm and trying to cook my own food. But I really took that advice, and I stopped having those episodes entirely. So I realized the effect in a really profound way of nutrition on my own body. And that was sort of, I guess, in the middle, because I was already a little bit aware of it with the horses because I'd already had this show horse experience, but I hadn't yet had the thoroughbred experience. So, in the middle, I guess, of that horse journey, I was also noticing that with my own body. And now I take that very seriously. I don't ever think I'll go into human nutrition in any kind of professional sense, but I do spend a lot of my own energy every day making sure that my own diet and lifestyle are fueling my body as well as possible, because I've realized the toll that can have if you kind of slip up there.
Yeah, for sure. And it definitely plays into, I think, pretty much all living beings. And so before we started recording, you mentioned that you're also a podcaster, and you have a podcast called The Whole Scoop. And so where I was kind of getting at with that, because I haven't listened to any of your podcasts, is the podcast around horse nutrition?
Some is around horse nutrition. The other person on the podcast, my co-host, is Jordan Holbrook. She's a body worker. And so we talk a little bit about body work as well. And then we have some guests, but the idea is really, it's just a holistic approach to horse care. And we talk about all different facets of that. So we've had we talk a lot about emotional health in ourselves and how that influences our horses, and what we get out of the horse-human relationship and what we put into it. And we've had a lot of really interesting conversations recently over there.
That sounds really exciting. Can you tell us a little bit about your horses?
Yeah, so I actually have 4 horses right now, which is the most I've ever had. And in Southern California, that's kind of a lot because land is expensive and hay is expensive. So I know other places in the world, people are like, 4 horses, no big deal. But for me, that's a lot. And so right now I have a 5-year-old Andalusian who I rescued as a 10-month-old baby. I guess I didn't rescue her. I adopted her from the Humane Society. I actually saw her on their Instagram one morning before work, and I just, for some reason, I saw her picture and I was like, that's my horse. And I drove straight to the Humane Society on my way to work that day and put in an application, like sight unseen. And she's been the best horse I could possibly imagine. And then the other personal horse that I have is also a rescue. He was kind of one of those cases where he was getting on an undisclosed truck to an undisclosed location after bucking a couple people off. And I just was not okay with where I was expecting that truck was headed to. So he's the most expensive horse I've ever purchased in my entire life. I spent $4,000, which I know is also not a lot of money, but I'm focusing so much on rescue. I've never spent that much on a horse before. And he's been also amazing. I don't ride him. He's just a to-have horse, as they say. And, but yeah, he's my buddy. And I'm hoping to ride him someday if he will let me, but I'm waiting for him to settle in and decide that that's okay. And I have also 2 school horses that I use to teach lessons on. So one is a retired A-circuit jumper, and he just wasn't ready to be turned out to pasture. He needed more of a purpose in life. He gets really depressed if he's not working. So he's my school horse for adults. He's massive, gentle giant. And then I have a little pony. She's a quarter pony, Rosie, and she's, also kind of had maybe a little bit of a hard life. She has some like scar tissue in a hind leg. But she's just so good with the kids. And I was thinking about this yesterday. I don't advertise this at all, but somehow I've ended up with, I think, 5 or 6 students that come ride as sort of a form of therapy that have various mental or physical ailments that they're working through. And she's the horse that I use for all of them because she is just like so patient and easygoing and takes really good care of them. But is also very athletic and can still do all the things that they want to do. So she allows them to canter around whether or not they have great balance or whatever else. So she's a great pony too.
How have you noticed nutrition and how it relates to the horse's willingness and ability to train and learn new things?
I think, to me, the analogy is like, if you give your kid sugar cereal before school, they're going to have a hard time doing math versus if you give them, I don't know, eggs and whole wheat toast, they might have a little more concentration at school. So a lot of our diets these days for horses are kind of mirroring our human diets where they're highly processed and they're high in sugars and they're a lot of synthetic nutrients that aren't necessarily easily absorbed or bioavailable to the horses. And that severely impedes, in my experience, their ability to focus and to have sustained energy that's not explosive. Like we tend to see these horses that they come out really, really hot and they need to be lunged down before anybody gets on them. And they have all this excess energy that they're so, I think of it as like an overfilled balloon. Like if you come out without just the right control, you can just lose that horse and they're just going to take off and not be able to focus and be bouncing off the walls and have this kind of chaotic energy. But if they have a balanced diet where they're getting the right ratio of complex carbs to fats to proteins, and they're able to use all of the nutrition in their diet that you're giving them, they tend to have more energy, but it's a really level, sustained energy. It's not that overfilled balloon, chaotic energy that kind of is really intense. And then once it's gone, they're really lazy and lethargic. We have this focused energy that we can actually use to do some cool things. And that's where, especially if you're training a horse, it's really important to look at their diet. But also, even if it's your pleasure horse and you just want to go on trail rides and you don't want them to be, come out spooky and looking for things to be afraid of and jumping at all the bushes, making sure that they have this really balanced diet can really help with that aspect of their behavior.
Yeah, that's so great. And It's really interesting to me how many parents, and you as a new parent, it sounds like you already have a good handle on it, but how many parents will, just because of, it seems like mostly because of like lack of time or willingness or ability to build in proper nutrition, but will just like send their kids off to school with the sugary cereal or muffin or what have you without even taking a second glance at that. And then it just becomes like filling the belly. And in the way of the horse world, I've seen, especially, so we're in like southern Arizona, so not too far from you. I mean, a bale of Bermuda right now is like, $18 to $22. And alfalfa is similar price, but maybe, $16 to $18. And so even that bit of savings, people, I would venture to say, maybe you have a different opinion, Alyssa, but I would say most people in our area feed strictly alfalfa, which our veterinarian is like, alfalfa shouldn't even be considered for a horse. And yeah, so I hear what you're saying about, the explosiveness and the training issues that can come up, and psychological issues even, because they're just not feeling well. We found with our horses a few years ago, we switched over to continuous feed through slow feed or hay nets, and we feed 99% Bermuda with some snacks here and there. What is your take on continuous feeding versus, the typical, 2 or 3 times a day?
Yeah, this is a huge thing for me, actually. I tend to look at the wild horse first, and then I heard this term recently as the biological norm as opposed to the cultural norm. So I look at the biological norm being the wild horse and how they behave and what they eat and what their day looks like, and then kind of adjust for knowing that we're often using our horses for sport and that they've been bred to have these different characteristics. So they're maybe slightly different from the wild horse in the way that they show up in terms of their energy or their jobs, so to speak, that we tend to give our horses. But their biology is very much the same in the way that they digest. Like on the inside, they're exactly the same as a wild horse. So the wild horse spends on average, I believe it's 10 hours a day. No, it's more than that. It's 16 hours a day eating. They walk an average of 10 miles while they're doing this. And because of that, they also are eating more than 20 varieties of plants in a day. And they produce over 10 gallons of saliva through that experience, which is kind of astonishing when you think about also, compared to our domestic horses that typically, especially if they feel like any anxiety about where their next meal is going to come from, they tend to only spend maybe 1 or 2 hours a day eating. They'll scarf down a flake of hay really fast. They tend to only eat a couple of varieties of plants, like whatever's in the hay that we give them. And they do it all standing still. So to me, the slow feeder is a really great way to start to bridge that gap between the biological norm and the cultural norm. And sorry, the baby's chatting away over here. But I think we owe it to our horses to at least do that, to at least slow down their meals so that they are producing more of that saliva. Their stomachs only actually have about a 1 gallon capacity, which if you think about how big a flake of hay is, and you think about the fact that they're eating that in probably 1 to 3 hours, the average horse, we're definitely overfilling and stretching their stomachs. And then they're going long stretches on an empty stomach, which their digestive systems are just not designed to do. The other thing that I really love are I don't know if you've seen those pellet balls that have been coming out, but if you fill those balls with pellets, it kind of simulates grazing, and that they have to, kick the ball and then they walk a few steps and they eat a few pellets and then they kick the ball again. And even in a very small corral, 2 of my horses right now live in a pasture situation and 2 live in in like 15 by 30 corrals, which is much smaller than I would ever really feel comfortable with. But again, in Southern California, we don't have a ton of choices there. But those pellet balls can actually get them moving even in a small space and simulate grazing. And I've noticed a huge difference in both behavioral and nutritional aspects when horses have access to something that kind of can help simulate a natural behavior like that.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that as well. And so it kind of leads me into my next question, and I think Alyssa will have a lot more questions on this, but maybe tell us a little bit more about the types of training that you do, because as of late, we've been really interested in doing so-called positive reinforcement, which there's a lot of nutritional background on that and a lot of misinformation out there, but definitely some good stuff there, we think.
Yeah, for sure. So, Alyssa, do you have anything to add before I jump into that one? Okay. So I also kind of came upon positive reinforcement somewhat recently because of the Mesa, the rescue horse the most expensive rescue horse I've ever gotten. When I first got him, it was so clear that he was traumatized and had been pretty severely abused. He was really flighty, really afraid of people, and always kind of what I've heard termed on the muscle, meaning like tense and ready to fight or flight all the time. And I just sort of instinctively was like, there's no way that pressure and release training is going to work for this horse, because that operates on a cortisol system in the body. And in a normal horse, their cortisol goes up when the pressure is put on and then comes back down when the pressure is taken off, and that's the reward. But for him, because his cortisol levels were high all the time, there was no room for it to go up and come down. And I just felt really compelled to find a different method for him. And the positive reinforcement, I started clicker training with him, and I had huge success right away because it operates on a completely different system for them. I do think there is maybe a place and time for both, because I think a lot of horses, like if you watch horses in the wild, they do operate on a pressure and release system. However, I think most humans tend to kind of exploit that and turn it into a fear-based training system, which it doesn't need to be. I think most horses really want to please and really want to work with us. So I think in a perfect world, there is a balance between so-called negative, the word is escaping me, negative reinforcement. Sorry, I don't know why that just happened. But negative reinforcement versus positive reinforcement, but using it in a non-fear-based way. And also, I think there are horses that really exclusively respond better to positive reinforcement. So I think both are really important. And nutritionally, again, horses are super motivated by food because they're foragers by nature. So using those hay pellets as sort of a reward, in my experience, has been really profound, because it's not so much of a reward that it kind of turns them into cookie monsters, where then they're just like sugar fiends and they're all over you and they're trying to find that next treat. But it's enough that it signals to them that they're safe and that there's abundance around them and that they can kind of relax and let their guard down, because there's an abundance of real food, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, that makes total sense. I'm curious, as a equine nutritionist and the positive reinforcement background, what kind of treats are you using or recommending to keep their nutritional level where it needs to be?
Yeah, so I mean, from a training perspective, I kind of think about quality versus quantity a little bit. So if you're doing kind of like a really high value reward, 1 or 2 sugary treats or molasses treats is not really going to make a difference in their nutrition. if you really need like a jackpot reward. Like, for example, with my more nervous horse, when I don't know, bring out a scary object that I'm hoping to kind of desensitize him to, I'll use more of those jackpot, really high sugar rewards, because that's going to really convince him that this is a good thing, if that makes sense, and like really get him on board quickly. But most of the time, like 99% of the time, I'm using grass hay pellets or alfalfa pellets if I need something a little bit more rich to entice somebody, because that's what they should really be eating anyway as the majority of their diet. So it doesn't, again, kind of have that negative nutritional impact. Some things that you can use for the kind of tastier, more high value rewards would be, in place of the sugary treats, dried fruit is a really good option. Like you can cut up some apple rings, and those don't get sticky if you're using a treat pouch or something, as opposed to like fresh apples. You can do dried berries are sometimes a big hit, or apple chips, or not apple chips, banana chips. You can also use, obviously, just like chopped up little pieces of carrot can work for some horses. So kind of getting creative with whole foods and real foods can be a great way to start that high value without actually giving them any negative like sugar spike or anything like that.
Yeah, that's really great. That seems to be pretty much what we're doing. Yeah. I did have a question about, so you mentioned negative reinforcement and the idea of how the horses interact amongst themselves in the wild. And this has been a hot topic for Alyssa and I for a while. And have you ever heard of that study? And I don't have a name or a resource that comes to mind, but there's this study that I read about a while ago, not dealing with horses in particular, but it was something about like telepathy, and what they were measuring was like they had people, and they were showing particular pictures on a screen, and the people were able to, and not people with any particular like ability or anything, just normal everyday people, were able to show an emotion through a recording device about the picture, and they were measuring the brain activity, and the brain was picking up the picture coming through before it even was presented on the screen. And so it just brings to mind like this whole like telepathic idea of how we as humans communicate. And then it leads me to think and understand that the horses in the wild, like their negative reinforcement as we see it as humans is like faster than instantaneous. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know it's kind of a roundabout question, but I think what I'm ultimately getting at is a lot of people take the whole, well, this is how they interact in the wild, to an extreme that is really not the case.
For sure. And I think we're still learning so much about how horses do interact in the wild, because they are kind of hard to really study, especially because what we consider wild horses here in the States are truly feral horses. They're not actually wild. So that makes it even maybe a little bit more tricky to study. But I think there's definitely something to that. I mean, the first thing that popped into my mind was my dog, which I know is not a horse, but I think it kind of goes to further your point that if I even think about like the beach, for example, he gets excited and starts running around and goes to the door like he thinks we're going to the beach. So I have to like watch my thoughts around my dog because I'm sure he's picking up on, something that I'm not even trying to send him a message and he's picking up on it. And I think horses are absolutely the same as well. My school horse Schroeder, the retired A-circuit jumper that I was talking about. One of the reasons I love him I teach a lot of adult beginners, because this is maybe a whole other topic, but I really believe in lowering the barriers to entry to our sport as a way of sort of indirectly improving the life of horses. Just having more people that are newer in the sport and that are educated on the current practices, as opposed to people that have kind of gate kept the equestrian sport for so long. But anyway, so I teach a lot of beginner adults, and I use this horse for them because he can pick up on people in a way that I can't, and I can use his body language and his reaction to them as a way to sort of know if they're ready for the next thing or not. So as an example, even I always start people out in the round pen. On somebody's first lesson, he will either sort of march around and like, walk like a normal horse around the outside of the round pen. And I have them do all kinds of balance exercises and drop your reins and drop your stirrups and all these things. And he's super safe about it. Or he will literally stand still and not move if that person has any kind of fear or apprehension. And even if that person isn't telling me that they're afraid or apprehensive, he's picking up on it, and he will stand completely still until I do like usually a couple breathing exercises with the rider and kind of help them get into their body a little bit and do like a little body scan. And then they start to relax, and then he'll kind of walk around and let them do all the balance exercises. And it's true of everything with him. Like if I'm having them practice pole work when they're a little bit more advanced, he won't go over the poles if they're off balance. Or if I'm thinking that they're ready to canter, he will refuse to pick up the canter, no matter what they do or no matter what I do, if he doesn't think that they're ready. And I've learned to really trust him in that. And I think he is definitely picking up on things with the rider even that are just much more profound and deep than anything I could ever possibly hope to perceive. And it's the same, with even, so that's horse to human. And I have started really incorporating that into my lesson program, where I teach people how to do a couple of breathing exercises or get into their body as a way to help influence the horse a little bit. If they're nervous, especially if they have their own horse and their horse is being reactive, the first thing I always do is help the human relax as much as possible to then indirectly help the horse to relax. But I think even, when you see it's a calm day and there's a whole bunch of horses around and one of them perks up and sees something and suddenly everybody's on guard, I think they're all wired into the same, I don't even know what they're, what we would even call it, but sort of like the same network of thought process. And if one of them notices, a bag flapping in the wind and thinks it's a monster, all of a sudden all the horses on the property are on edge and ready for whatever's going to pop out of the bush. So yeah, I definitely think there's a lot to that. And there's a lot more that we need to learn. And that's where I think I'm careful even in using the term negative reinforcement, especially with people that aren't aware of what that really means, because it has such a strong negative connotation, and it can be an excuse for people to then become forceful with their horse. And I just think, I always say, if you were to arm wrestle your horse, there's no way you'd ever win. So there's no reason to try to force them. They don't need to be forced to do anything because they want to do it. They want to please you, and they're herd animals and they want to work with you. And so that's where I think we have to be careful with that term, negative reinforcement. I wish there was almost another word for just that idea of kind of communicating with body language in a way that the horses interpret as a familiar language. And I haven't found that word yet. So if you know of one, please share, because I would love to change the language that I'm using around that if possible.
Yeah, I hear that, and it's such a controversial thing in the training world, I found. There's a trainer, he's out of Spain, his name is Lockie Phillips, and he has a emotional horsemanship-based training, which I have I mean, I've been in that a little bit. It seems to be more of like a gentler, the horse chooses. I haven't found a better word for the quote unquote negative reinforcement or natural horsemanship, as much as, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if we necessarily know how natural horsemanship is. And again, I'm biased, but there's that.
Yeah, I love Lockie also. He actually was, we did an interview with him on The Whole Scoop on my podcast.
How cool.
Yeah, it was amazing. I felt a little starstruck. But yeah, I mean, I just feel like I would love someday to be able to go to a clinic of his, because I just feel like he has such a gift with horses and such a like amazing way of sharing in a really articulate way his thought process that actually can then influence the people, because that's the whole thing really, right? Is it's one thing if this trainer has this gift with horses, but if they can't share that with the people and teach the people about how to do that, then it doesn't really go very far. So yeah, he's incredible. He has that for sure.
Yeah, definitely. It's this, I mean, horses are such, they're such angels. They're such, I don't even know. They're just beautiful individuals, and to be able to share this life with them it's amazing and profound, and they have so many lessons to teach.
Yeah,
and just another shout out to Lockie Phillips. He was one of our guests back on episode 27, and so listeners can catch him there, and then also on Ruby's podcast here called The Whole Scoop. And Ruby, I wanted to let this go, but I don't think I can. I have to ask you a little bit more about you. You mentioned a term, and this doesn't have to do with the nutritional aspects, but as we were talking, you mentioned that the wild horses in America are actually considered feral. Can you fill me in on that, on your take? And I'll leave it at that, because I have a different approach and I'm quite biased.
Oh yeah, no, I'd love to hear yours too, for sure. I have to say I am not a Mustang trainer. I'm not deep in that world by any means. So if I, have misinformation, please inform me, because I am always looking for, to grow and to become a better horse person. But my understanding is that because they're not truly native, I think they were once native and they became extinct here, but the current bloodlines of wild horses and Mustangs that we have here are descendants from, in my understanding again, escaped horses from settlers that came, and that they, in some ways, we can trace them back to horses, particularly I think Andalusians are a big, or those kind of Baroque horses were a big piece of this genetic puzzle, but horses that were bred to have a particular purpose to serve humans at one point back in time, and that they're not like a direct descendants entirely from wild horses, if that makes sense, that at some point there was some human intervention in their bloodlines and some human intervention in their genetics.
I can hear and understand where your thought process is going on that. We do have 2 previously wild Mustangs, and we have had the pleasure of talking with a few people who are deep into the wild horse, arguably a lot deeper than even Dad and I are. And our perspective, or my perspective on it, is I mean, as much as the science could trace them back to where the science is going to trace them, they are living in a wild environment. They are forced to take care of themselves. There is no human intervention unless humans intervene with their care. And I personally feel like feral has a very negative connotation, and it points this sort of wild horses are mean and aggressive, and they have this this want and desire to hurt and harm things, and that hasn't been my experience with the wild horses. I've only had the pleasure of really interacting with my two. Eventually I would love to go and, experience a herd, but I do see them as wild individuals. They are the reason for many tourist attractions in many states, being as human populated as they are because of their existence. But that's my take on it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I definitely, now that you're saying it that way, I can see the negative connotation for sure. And maybe it kind of comes back again to that idea of like, maybe we need a new word, like maybe we need a word to describe both the biological definition of feral versus wild, as well as our current cultural definition of feral versus wild, because for sure I agree with you that in terms of our cultural definition, they are truly wild horses, and they do completely fend for themselves in most cases. And yeah, I can for sure see how that terminology could be problematic. Absolutely. Especially in this moment right now that we're in with the wild horses, where people do tend to have really strong opinions one way or the other about whether or not they have a right to be here. And I think that is definitely an issue that we being the broader equestrian community should probably address at some point.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I didn't mean to put you on the spot with that. And it is nitpicking words, but in the interest of a podcast and conversation, I think it's really important, especially with the mission that Alyssa and I feel within our hearts with regard to the wild horses, not only in America, but worldwide. And so I'll just piggyback on that. Like if we go to the dictionary and look at the term feral, it actually says in a wild state, especially after escape from captivity or domestication. And then the second definition is resembling a wild animal. And then, the dictionary gives like a sub definition of that, like an example, and it's a quote, feral snarl and a feral cat. And so just to piggyback on what you just eloquently said about, maybe we need a different term or a way of expressing it. And see, our feeling is that, at least here in America, when it comes to the wild horses on the range, the big controversy really lies in the movement of money across corporations and commercial cattle grazing and sheep grazing. And the wild horses, burros, and other species are actually just scapegoated in that process. And they use the term feral because as humans, especially in American English, we're conditioned to understand feral as being a snarling dog or a cat that is just rabid and might have rabies or something like that, and is just a nuisance to society. And so I think it's really important to just delineate that, regardless of the controversy of where these actual bloodlines existed, because there's so much controversy. I mean, we have like petroglyphs that are indigenous in nature that we can go back to with people drawn out as being like on horseback, and it totally blows away the idea that horses just kind of escaped from, I think, the Spaniards, but I'm not a history buff. Anyways, I just want to point that out, and I thank you so much for your willingness to have that conversation cleanly and discuss it, because it is near and dear to our heart for sure.
Yeah, I'm definitely here for the hard conversations. I love, like I said, I'm always looking to become a more well-rounded horse person and learn more about these things. And the Mustang world is fascinating to me, and I hope maybe someday to get into it more deeply than I am. But I so appreciate you taking the time to call me out on that and educate me about it, because that never would have crossed my mind prior, that word that I was perceiving as a biological term could be, have such a different meaning and context that could be really harmful. So that's really, I really appreciate you taking the time to tell me that.
Yeah, and I think that also just plays out into the training world and just horsemanship as a whole. And we had a talk with Mr. Scott Beckstead. He's an attorney, and that's episode number 36 if our listeners want to go back to that and listen. But of course, in the world of law, language is everything. And it's just interesting because he mentioned that on the books, like the actual law and what the Bureau of Land Management is under, they actually, the books actually call them wild horses. And as such, because of that term, the Bureau of Land Management is actually charged with the safekeeping and protection of the wild horses, but they neglect that. And so there's a lot of controversy in it. So I appreciate the discussion on it. And it does lead me kind of into this thought because it kind of brings up sort of indigenous wisdom and ideas, which a while ago you mentioned breathing and teaching your students some breath work as you can feel the horse relaying to you a particular message about that individual who might be on their back or doing some groundwork with them. And I'm curious if you have any sort of spiritual practice on your own accord or breath work that you do as a daily practice that might connect you into some indigenous wisdom that comes from eons ago before we walked this planet.
For sure, potentially. I think, I do definitely just continuously in my daily life practice sort of mindfulness and breath work, but it's not something that I necessarily intentionally set aside a whole bunch of time. I would love to get to a point in my life where I have time to and I know, you make time for these things, but that I would be able to really intentionally sit down and create a practice. But I definitely just incorporate it. We actually just talked about this recently on an episode of my podcast to keep kind of mentioning that. But as an example, I always take a moment to sort of intentionally ground myself and take a deep breath every time I tighten a girth before I get on a horse. And I just kind of do it. I started doing it originally as a way to kind of, especially back, I used to ride lots and lots of horses in a day. And now I do a lot more groundwork and maybe I ride one or two. But I started this back when I was riding lots and lots of horses because I felt the need to sort of cleanse whatever had happened in the previous ride and reset before the next ride. And now I do it almost kind of as just rote habit. I don't even really have to remind myself to do it. I just, as I'm tightening a girth, I take a moment to feel my feet and take a deep breath and then I hop on the horse. So yeah, I think there's probably things that I'm not even really aware that I'm doing frequently, but I just try to incorporate those little moments into my life as they come up. But I wouldn't say I necessarily have a strong practice where I'm intentionally setting aside an hour to work on that aspect at this moment in my life.
I think any little ritual or practice of sorts, I mean, that breathing before you put the girth on is that's beautiful. I've never actually heard of that one being done, but it's cool to hear the other, what we're all doing as incorporating into our horse lives.
Yeah, and that just sort of like reminds me of our mantra that we kind of came up with a while ago. It's called communication, not control. And, I personally will whisper that to the horses as I'm haltering them or really doing anything where I'm asking them to do something. And it just helps with that grounding process. So I like the fact that you don't have a particular practice per se, but you recognize that it's a practice nonetheless, and it's something that's beneficial for you and your horse. As we move to kind of wrap up and such, do you like to read?
I love to read.
Do you have anything that you're reading currently that you would like to share?
Ooh. I have to admit, I'm not reading a lot of horse stuff right now because I have a newborn, so I'm reading a lot of stuff about babies.
Yeah, it could be anything.
What am I reading right now? I'm kind of in between things. What did I read recently? I'm trying to think because I've got something here. Oh, I'm about to start this one that I think has been very highly recommended to me. I don't know if you've read this one yet. It's called A Novel Horse by Geraldine Brooks.
No, I haven't.
So I'm about to get into that one.
Very cool.
And I don't know anything about it yet, other than just several people have told me that it's really good. This says, a discarded painting in a junk pile, a skeleton in an attic, and the greatest racehorse in American history. From these stands, a Pulitzer Prize winner braids a sweeping story of spirit, obsession, and injustice.
Wow.
So,
yeah, I'll definitely have to check that
one out.
For sure. Well, thank you for that. Is there any last minute sort of wisdom or advice or guidance you would recommend to our listeners?
I just always feel like keep learning and keep exploring different things. Like I mentioned, I came originally from a dressage show background, and now I don't even really know if I could really ascribe a particular discipline to what I do. I think the more you just learn about all of the different ways that people do things, the more you kind of refine and find what really resonates for you. And that's, I think, where the real gold is in anything in life, but especially in the horse world. So yeah, just keep learning and just find what works for you.
I couldn't agree more. And it seems like the more we are open and willing to change our approach to things and be open and willing to know that we don't know and learn as much as we possibly can all the time, the better it is for us and our horses. Where can people reach you at if they want to get in touch?
Yeah, so definitely the podcast that I've mentioned a few times, The Whole Scoop, as well as I have a website, rubydossequine.com. I have Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, all at rubydossequine. Yeah, I think those are all the simple places to find me.
Well, great, Ruby. And we'll definitely put links to all of your social media and such out on our show notes page. And we do truly appreciate you being with us, and best of luck to you and your horsemanship and also your new parenting journey.
Thank you so much.
All right. You have a great afternoon. We'll talk to you again soon.
Sounds good.